eCORRECTOR webinar, top tips and common mistakes in scientific writing. And we're really happy to have Dr. Jerry Carr-Bryan here, who's one of our editors and proofreaders that we've worked with for many, many years. He's a really does a really great job on the text. He's got an amazing scientific background. I'll let Jerry explain a little bit more about that. But I just want to introduce a little bit about my company, eCORRECTOR. I'm a scientist. I've worked in various different institutes, and our ethos at eCORRECTOR is for scientists by scientists. So we feel that scientists understand the expectations of reviewers and journal editors and know how to edit text so that they can meet those very strict standards that often journals set. We work with a lot of different proofreaders and editors from many of the leading institutes across the world, mostly based in UK and America, some in Australia and some as far afield as South Africa. We're really pleased that we work with a lot of different institutes, universities and various different research centres, mainly in Poland, but also increasingly other countries like Italy, France, and we also provide editing for quite a few journals as well. Before we start, I just wanted to share these two really funny slides. It shows sort of where why it's so important to get your language right, because these are one on the left hand side. I think they're both from America actually. On the left hand side they've spelt school wrong on the road, which is really funny. It's a mistake that you don't want to make. And many years ago when there was the American election, Mitt Romney, one of the candidates, had his Make America Better campaign, and really embarrassingly they spelt America wrong and they put Mercia, and that went out for quite a few hours. It was quite an unexpected thing that you don't necessarily find, but anyway, it illustrates that everybody needs to get their texts checked and edited, and today Jerry will give us some pointers about things that we can do to make our texts even better, some common mistakes that people make when writing texts. Jerry is a chemistry PhD. His talk is not specifically about chemistry, it's very general. So although we might have chemists in the audience, this content is relevant for people from all diverse scientific backgrounds. Jerry's got he's a member of the Royal Society of Chemistry and chartered chemist. C-Chem means chartered chemist. Is that right, Jerry? Did I get that right? Yeah. He's got a lot of expertise, pharmaceuticals, agrochemicals and fragrance chemicals. And as I mentioned, we've really enjoyed working with Jerry for many years. He's been one of the people that we've worked with. One of the longest one of the longest periods of time that we've worked with a proofreader, an editor. I'll just close with one little thing, or one big thing rather, not a little thing. It's a big achievement. Jerry has published a book about process developments for chemists, and it really just shows that the marriage between having good English and good understanding of science is so important to convey a clear message about what you want to say. So Jerry, I'm gonna switch over to you. In terms of the audience, I've already checked with Jerry, and if there are particular questions that people want to ask during the presentation, it's okay to unmute yourself and just ask. If you prefer to write in the chat, then that's fine, write in the chat and I can ask the question. And as well, we're going to have a short time at the end for questions and answers, because sometimes people prefer to wait till the end of the talk to ask their questions. So it's quite informal, it's quite relaxed, but hopefully it will be a very, very informative 30, 45 minutes of listening to what Jerry has to say.
Well, welcome everyone. So this is top tips and common mistakes in scientific writing. Now, at the risk of repeating what Mark's just kindly said, I've been a proofreader for eCORRECTOR for about 7 years, and that's given me a good insight into the various pitfalls and mistakes which tend to occur again and again in scientific writing. And just a quick advert for my book, which is aimed both for chemists starting off in industry and also at academics and students who want to know a bit about the common process development challenges faced by those in industry. Okay. Now, if you want to write a scientific paper, there are lots of things you need to do before you write it. And first of all, it may be obvious, but check you've done all the experiments you need to. And sometimes there are obvious control experiments which aren't carried out, and reviewers will pick up on this and you'll have to go back again and start all over again. And secondly, stick to a clear story. Make sure everything should be there and leave out any irrelevant experiments which might have seemed worth doing at the time, but don't really fit into the story of your paper. Now, thirdly, and probably most importantly, read the instructions for authors for the journal to which you submit your paper. Now, these may be called author guidelines or a guide for authors, various names depending on the journal. If you read those, and however long they are, this will make writing your paper so much easier and save a good deal of time. And lastly, decide whether to write in UK English or US English. And many journals will accept either. But what they won't like is a sort of mishmash of the two. So choose one and stick to it. Now, what I've got here, I've just got a little bit of the information for authors from OPR&D, so that's Organic Process Research and Development, which is published by the American Chemical Society. I'm not going to go through all of this. You can notice this is part of where they have the particular templates they encourage you to use. There's abbreviations. They refer to the ACS style guide, which will give more detail on how they want you to write. There's a bit on nomenclature and labeling compounds. And this is only a small bit of pages of information for authors. As I said before, if you read this, your task will be a lot simpler. Okay, and as I mentioned before, there are quite a few differences between US English and UK English. I mean, I couldn't list them all, but here are some of the very common ones, particularly colour, odour, which you get all the time. So what you have to do is decide, are you going to write in US English or UK English, and stick to that throughout. Advice on style. So avoid long sentences with lots of different clauses, since they often lead to confusion. On the other hand, avoid very short sentences, since they can sound childish. You want to be understood, but not sound like, you know, a kindergarten introduction to reading book. And then avoid sentences with too many adjectives, which I often come across in introductions and conclusions. So I've got a sentence such as, the ever-changing past decades have seen a tremendous continuous augmentation in the overall powers of chromatographic resolution. Sounds a lot better if you write chromatographic resolution has greatly improved over recent decades. Now, in general, keep to the past tense with some exceptions. And this is something I often see is people write one sentence in the past tense, one in the present, one in the past. And it sounds very strange to a native English person. So in the methods and results section, nearly everything you report should be in the past tense. The yeast was added to the buffer solution. And the only exception is when you refer to figures or tables. So figure 1 shows, or table 2 shows. Now, when discussing the work of others, this will typically be in the introduction or discussion sections, well-established facts can be written in the present tense, such as sodium metal reacts violently with water. You know, no scientist is going to disagree with that. But where there is disagreement, or if you're reporting the results of a single research group, use the past tense, like Bloggs et al. Claim to have achieved high enantioselectivity using magnetic fields. Oh, okay, they may have claimed it, but until it's been verified by another group, there may well be some doubt as to this result. It's not a well-established fact yet. Now we'll go on to grammar. Now we've got, one thing I often see is leaving out a or the. So we removed obtained precipitate with Buchner filtration apparatus. Should be, we removed the obtained precipitate with a Buchner filtration apparatus. And then you often get the opposite thing, putting in the when not needed. So an easy way to remember this is in English, most nouns referring to particular physical objects are preceded by a or the, or some other appropriate words such as some, any, each, no. And there's a whole list of other words which can be used instead. Where we don't use anything is when discussing a class of objects in general or abstract concepts, where no article or equivalent is needed. So a sentence like the chromatographic methods are essential for modern biochemistry should be chromatographic methods are essential to modern biochemistry. And also sayings such as science progresses one funeral at a time, meaning that progress in science only occurs when one generation who have been brought up with the new ideas replaces the previous one. Okay, 3, putting adjectives after a noun, not before. So unlike other languages, adjectives are nearly always before a noun in English. So a sentence like the precipitate above mentioned was centrifuged should be the above mentioned precipitate was centrifuged. And similarly, putting makes of instrument after the model, where they should be in front. So HPLC was carried out with a 1290 Infinity 2 adjuvant, should be HPLC was carried out with an adjuvant 1290 Infinity 2. So you think Volkswagen Golf, not Golf Volkswagen. Now we've got misuse of during, which for some reason happens a lot. So I often see the mixture was heated during 5 hours. Well, this should be the mixture was heated for 5 hours. So during refers to something that happened within a particular period of time. For example, the mixture was heated for 5 hours. During this time, a yellow solid precipitated, or medicine was very primitive during the Middle Ages, and so on. Something that happened within a particular period of time. And number 6, we've got the use of where in is needed. An increase of weight of 2 grams should be an increase in weight of 2 grams. Similarly, a rise of temperature of 2 degrees C should be a rise in temperature of 2 degrees C. And it's the same pattern for weights, measures, temperature, and so on. Now, this is where English becomes a bit illogical, so bear with me. So we don't use in for columns, evaporators, etc. So the glycosides were separated in an HPLC column. So here in should be replaced by on or with or by, and any of those is fine for columns. Similarly, and this is illogical, we remove solvents on a rotary evaporator, or you can say with a rotary evaporator. However, we do dry solids in an oven, stir substances in a flask, and work in a glove box when necessary. Isn't English fun? If you're not sure, with applies to most pieces of equipment. Lastly, we've got to the use of double negatives. In English, two negative words, such as not or no, make a positive statement. So we didn't obtain no crystals on adding ammonia solution, means that some crystals were obtained. So the sentence should be, we didn't obtain any crystals on adding ammonia solution. So no plus not, make a yes. Now, some of you may have heard of Pink Floyd, an old English rock band, who famously sung, "We don't need no education," but such phrases are best avoided in formal writing. Now, we're going on to word choices. 3 common word choice mistakes. And first of all, we get confusion between lead and lead, and even native English people get this wrong. So these results lead us to change our approach. And so we started using platinum catalysts. Should be, these results led us to change our approach, LED. And so we started using platinum catalysts. So lead, L-E-A, or lead, I should say, L-E-A-D is the present tense, while lead, L-E-D is the past tense, and the form you'll normally need to use. Now you also got the metal, lead, which is nothing to do with the verb, and that too is L-E-A-D. And secondly, we've got the misuse of made when carried out or run is needed. So I often see things like the experiment was made under both acidic and basic conditions. Well, this should be the experiment was run under both acidic and basic conditions. So in English, we make a cake or we make a noise, but we carry out or run experiments. And 3, this is something that isn't strictly wrong. It's more a question of style. That's the use of works to mean papers, studies, or references. Various works have reported abnormal bacteria should be various papers have reported abnormal bacteria, or various studies have reported abnormal bacteria. So in English, works as a noun, it usually means sewage treatment works. That's the sort of thing it will bring to the head of an English person reading the paper. So just be careful about that. Now we come on to punctuation. I often have misplaced apostrophes, such as Alzheimer's disease, where the apostrophe becomes before the S, because there's only one Alzheimer we're talking about. Or again, both precipitates were, where you don't need an apostrophe at all. Now, one peculiar thing is statistics, where it should be students t-test with a capital letter and an apostrophe. Since student was a pseudonym, there's actually a statistician who was working for a beer company, for the Guinness Beer Company. They were told to publish any papers under a pseudonym, hence student. And secondly, we've got the use of colons where commas or brackets are needed. So here's a colon after metals. So 2 metals, titanium and tantalum, resisted the acidic mixture. Now this should be two metals, titanium and tantalum, with commas. Or if you prefer, it's much the same, you can use brackets for your two metals. Now, columns are used to introduce lists, but normally long lists with no subsequent writing in the same sentence. And lastly, the most dangerous mistake is the use of decimal commas instead of decimal points. So in both UK and US English, we always use decimal points, so full stops for decimals. So an instruction such as carefully add 1,333 grams of concentrated nitric acid would lead to an English-speaking chemist adding 1.33 kilograms and probably giving a rather vigorous reaction. Now, I'm coming on specifically for chemistry and biochemistry papers. So apologies for those of you who aren't chemists or biochemists, but this is in my particular area of expertise. Now, first of all, draw structures wherever possible and make sure they are clear, which can be tricky with 3D structures. If necessary, draw views from different perspectives, e.g. a side view and top view of a protein active site. So I've got a simple example I've drawn myself. So this is hemoglobin from above and from the side. I've left out various bits just to make it clear what the actual structure is. Obviously, as examples get more and more complicated and you've got more and more groups or amino acids in there, it becomes more and more necessary to put in the structure from different perspectives so it's clear what you're actually drawing. Now, secondly, avoid ambiguity with regard to compounds. So always refer to structures by numbers where possible. Thus, nitroketone 8 in figure 2 is better than just the nitroketone. And most guides to authors will have something about that. I mean, often they want the number of compounds to be in bold. So 8 in this example would be in bold fonts, so it could stand out on the page. And next, make clear what yield refers to. This is something reviewers will pick up on. So is it molar yield of isolated material assayed by a validated method against a purified standard? Is it selectivity or merely percentage area by HPLC? And you'll probably get quite different numbers depending what you count as your yield. Now, experimental details and spectra can usually be put into the supporting information section, depending on the policy of the journal. Make sure these are complete. And all journals will have guidelines for authors, which will tell you what can and can't be put into supporting information. And make sure all new small molecule compounds are characterized by NMR, IR, and either MS or elemental analysis. And existing compounds should have these reported if they're not already in the literature. I mean, occasionally you'll make a compound which was only previously made in, say, 1950 or earlier, which may have IR and elemental analysis, but it won't have NMR or MS that far back. So it's good for you to provide it, so at least it's in the literature. And for new peptides and proteins, accurate sequencing is required. So we can use Edmond degradation or various mass spectrometry methods, which will give the same result, or at least hopefully give the same result. Now, one thing I often see is confusion between genes and the proteins expressed by the gene. And the convention here is genes are written in italics, so AFP, while the protein is not written in italics, so AFP. Now I'll come to medicines. So normally you want to refer to medicines by the generic name. I mean, if necessary, you can add a trade name in brackets. So you use ibuprofen with no capital rather than Nurofen with a capital, unless a particular formulation of ibuprofen is relevant.
Jerry,
yeah.
Do you want to just go through that last point again? Because I think it's a really critical, important thing about the ibuprofen and the Nurofen. Maybe with another example or something like that, because it's something that happens a lot in texts. And I think people sometimes confused about when to capitalize and when not to capitalize. Do you want to just maybe go through that again with just a different example? Is that all right?
Yes. So something like, say, Valium would that was a tranquilizer or whatever, or anti-anxiety drug, and that is a trade name, so that will be a capital V. But normally you'd refer to it by its generic name, which I've forgotten at the moment, but
diazepam, isn't it? Diazepam.
Yeah.
So diazepam in that case would be little d.
Yeah.
Valium would be big V, wouldn't it? That's the thing. Okay, brilliant. Thanks. There's a few more questions. There's a few questions in the chat, but I think it's maybe easier we do it at the end. There's just some more questions, but they're not specifically about this point.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Yes.
Thanks, Jerry.
Now, take care with enantiomers. This is something that reviewers will pick up on. So do not confuse big D and big L, so the absolute configuration, with little d plus and little l minus. These are optical rotation. And most journals now prefer you not to use little d and little l, but you still get them in the older literature. Now, it's important that all the amino acids in protein are L, apart from glycine, which is achiral. Most of these are S, but there are two exceptions, which are cysteine and selenocysteine, which are both the R isomer. This is simply because of the priority rules, and a big atom like sulfur or selenium makes the priority go in a different manner to all the other amino acids. So that's one thing to remember. All amino acids are S, apart from glycine, which is achiral, and cysteine and selenocysteine, which are of the R isomer. Now, this is something which is very important, and we get all the time when we're modifying papers. So explain your abbreviations. While most journals will accept very common abbreviations, such as NMR and THF without explanation, any others should be explained where they first appear in the text. Now I've got an example here, right? The ketone was then reacted with potassium hexamethyl disilazide, KHNDS. Now, once you've introduced the abbreviation, it's best to use it rather than the full name in the following text. But again, this is something which will normally be explained in the guide to authors on the journal website. So every journal will have its own policy about this. As some journals prefer to have all the abbreviations listed on the first page of a paper. But that's fairly uncommon nowadays, but there are a few that still want a nice list of abbreviations on the first page. Now here's something that's nothing to do with writing per se, but it's a problem of false positives, which you often see when people are looking for new pharmaceuticals or agrochemicals. They're binding small molecules to proteins. But there are some small molecules that bind to many proteins in a non-specific manner. These are referred to as PAINs, so pan-assay interference compounds. I've attached a reference. I mean, there are several papers about this in the literature. I mean, it's a well-known problem. But it's easy to shout, Eureka, I've found a really active molecule, and all you've got is one of these PAINs. So rhodonines are a typical example of PAIN compounds, and these will interact in a non-specific way with many proteins, but they aren't in general active in a pharmaceutical sense. There's no point wasting everyone's time pursuing these. So to summary, overall aim for clarity. Make it clear what problem you are addressing and how particular experiments fit in with this goal. And lastly, don't give up if one journal rejects your paper. If it's well written and reports significant results, it will probably find a home elsewhere. The countless good papers have been rejected, and then they've been accepted by another journal and got lots of citations and even become classics in their field. And you can think of the man who turned down the Beatles. Right? Don't give up if you're rejected.
I'm going to read out some questions, Jerry, because we've got them. So relating to use of articles. So can we say the student t-test? Similarly, can we say the Wang model or the Weber law, rather than saying Weber's law, Wang's model, student's t-test? Do you see what I mean? It's using the definite article the in front.
Yeah.
What's your take on that? You think it's okay or best not? What do you?
I think if you're using the possessive, then you don't want the in front of it. So Wang's model. But if you're not using possessive, then you can, the Wang model. That makes sense to me.
I
wouldn't say the student's t-test.
Yeah.
So we employed students t-test. There's no need for the there. It sounds odd.
So as a general rule, if people are listening and they, you know, probably a lot of the people are students that are listening, and probably they will use students t-test at some point when they write a report. Really, the take-home message is not to use the student's t-test, is it? It's just you use student's t-test. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to think of in this
using student's t-test.
Yeah, you have to think of student as a person.
Yeah.
So it'd be Mark's t-test. You wouldn't say the Mark's t-test. That sounds very odd.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. So we've got another question. I think maybe there's a few. How about names, the names of anatomical structures? Should they be capitalized or not? Should they and chemicals be used with articles, which or not? Anatomical structures, should they be capitalized or not?
No. Things like brain, heart, liver, no, we don't capitalize. The only time you would is if it involved a name. So, I mean, anatomy is not my subject, but if it was a particular structure was named after a person, then there'll be a capital on the name.
And should the structures and chemicals be used with articles or not? Do you think there's a general rule, grammatical rule for when you use chemicals with a the or an a? Or
well, it's the same as anything else. So
In your
With
example,
the first, so it's just the same as anything else. So the first time you use it, we produced a new nitroketone for the first time. And then second sentence, the nitroketone was very unstable. It's the same as I saw a cat. The cat chased a mouse. So the first time you refer to something, use a or an, and subsequently the or.
but can I?
Yeah, Eva. Eva speaks English really well.
Question.
I know Eva. So go ahead.
Continue on that. But I guess, as I remember well, in your example of ibuprofen, you haven't used any articles of that. So it's like a name. It's the ibuprofen, an ibuprofen that I give to my animals, or is just ibuprofen that I give to animals?
Yeah, normally we just use ibuprofen.
Okay, so what's the rule? That's a chemical name. That's the name of the substance.
We don't normally use an article with drugs, because there's a name of a particular thing. Well, if you're saying the nitroketone, then you're referring to a particular structure. So again, and the same with substances like beta carotene, say, or vitamin A. We wouldn't say the vitamin A has lots of conjugated bonds in, we'd say vitamin A.
But the vitamins as a group. Like with ibuprofen, would we use non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, the non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, but ibuprofen without the?
I think for non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, generally, if it was talk about them in general, you wouldn't use any article.
In plural, but in singular?
No, the only time you would use an article, if earlier on in your paper, you're talking about particular non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, you might use an article. You might say later on, the non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs used in these tests all gave the following results. In general, when we talk about drugs or groups of drugs, in general, then there's no article. But if we're talking about a particular subset of these, which you previously used or previously described, then we might use the. In most cases, we don't use any article for drugs or vitamins or particular compounds. So it's only when you're referring to something you've already put in your paper and drawn a structure. So we say the nitroketone number 8 or the amino acid 11 and so on. You're talking about a structure which you've assigned to something and you're describing in your paper. It may seem illogical, but that's how English works.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I would say that there aren't that many examples where you would write the ibuprofen or the drug. Yeah, they're probably, as Jerry said, there's some exceptions, but I can't really add anything to what Jerry said. It's a very weird thing to explain, but it's sort of what sounds right and what doesn't sound right. But there should be some clearer grammatical rule to follow. But generally speaking, I would say that you don't use the definite article or indefinite article before the name of a chemical or the name of a drug or the name of
and the anatomy.
Anatomy, I was just thinking about that. As we spoke, because you do use it with anatomical structures. You do use it, don't you? You do use it all the time with anatomical structures.
We say the brain or diseases of the brain. So,
the somatosensory system, the cerebellum. You do say it with anatomical structures, but with drugs specifically, I would not use it with drugs. But with brain regions, because you were talking about.
Yeah, we would say the pituitary gland. So anatomy doesn't follow the same rules as chemicals and drugs.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you say a cerebellum or a thalamus?
I would say more the thalamus. Yeah, we've got a couple more questions because Zoom is going to kick us out in 10 minutes or something.
Sure, sorry.
It's really stimulating a question. Thank you for that. How concise the writing should be versus repetitive or paraphrase to make the point clear. So what's your opinion on that, whether things should be repeated, ideas, concepts repeated so that they're really, really clear, so nobody can miss them, or whether everything should be short and to the point? I think that's the main question there. What's your take on that? How elaborate the writing should be in academic texts?
I think most of the time you should only say things once, but obviously when ideas are very complex, it may well be worth adding a second sentence just to make it absolutely clear, particularly when confusion is liable. So if you have a long sentence, which has to be long because of the complex ideas in there, it may well be worthwhile adding a second sentence just to clarify. But in general, no, it should be possible just to explain your idea in a single sentence. There shouldn't be any need to repeat yourself.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I don't fully get the question. So you use articles for objects and not concepts. So I think it's relating to what we were discussing a few moments earlier. Use of articles for objects.
We tend, for abstract concepts, we tend not to use articles. So things like science or wisdom or happiness, you don't say the happiness is everyone's goal or something like that. So articles tend to be used with specific real things you can actually hold in your hand or see. So the cat, the moon, the sun, the earth. I suppose that's why in anatomy, the brain, and so on.
Okay, I don't think we've got any more questions unless anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask. So if nobody does, then I'm going to ask a couple of questions from my side. So Jerry, for like students that are maybe going to write their first paper, okay, which what's your advice? What's your advice you'd give to say PhD students? Their supervisor said they've got enough to write the paper. Let's say their supervisor's really busy, and then so it's the student that's going to be doing the first draft alone. What would be your advice to them, maybe both scientifically and linguistically?
Well, scientifically, just make sure you've done all the necessary experiments before you start writing. and particularly control experiments are often missed out. So, you know, if you've got a super new catalyst, and, you know, make sure you've done this runs without the catalyst, or with, you know, if there's a base in there as well, do a run with the catalyst but without the base. And so these are just basic things, but reviewers will pick up from them. Once you actually start writing, yes, the two things I would do is, as I said before, read the instructions for authors or author guide or whatever the journal calls it. And then if you can find a paper written in the same journal about a similar topic, preferably written by a native English American writer, that will show you how these things are done. So you can see how they express themselves, what terms they use, what terms they don't use. So if you can look at papers which have already been through all the editing process and have been accepted, particularly if they're a very similar field, that will give you a great idea about what terminology to use, what's acceptable. So, you know, don't be afraid to copy the style. As long as you don't copy the content, you can always copy the style.
Yeah, and then one last thing, and then probably we can wrap up. But what would you say, in your experience of editing text, is there? You mentioned a lot. You mentioned, I think, about 10 examples. But what would be the standout example of the most common mistake that you see occurring again and again?
Yeah, I mean, probably confusion over English articles and using the comma rather than the full stop for decimals. I see those in maybe not quite half, but certainly at least 1 in 3 papers I look at have got mistakes in those two areas. I know it's not easy if English isn't your native language.
Yes. Okay, so Jerry, I'm going to close the meeting in a minute. I just want to say one thing. It's really to the audience. At eCORRECTOR, we made a calendar. We've got a calendar that's an academic calendar that works from October 2022 to the end of the academic year 2023. So if anybody wants a calendar, just drop us an email, and we'll be very happy to post you a calendar. It's mainly for Polish audience because the months are in Polish. So it's great that that you managed to join us today, and hopefully you learned some things that you didn't know before, and you'll be able to implement them in your writing. If you have any questions, then and you haven't managed to ask, then just send an email, and we can relay those to Jerry as well. If you want a calendar, email us as well, and we'll with your address, and we will send you one. And that's it. It just remains for me to thank you very much, Jerry, for your presentation and for all those interesting things that we might not all remember. So we're going to be able as well to make Jerry's PowerPoint presentation available as well for people that are interested. So, all right, I'm going to close the meeting. Have a good evening, everybody. And we're going to have another presentation by a different editor, scientist, I think in about a month's time. So we'll let you know all about that as well in the future. Okay. Thanks a lot and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Jerry. Bye-bye.